Like vampires and ghouls? Superheroes and androids? Want to learn how to write them? The Speculative Fiction Academy is perfect for you. With 5 curriculum tracks and 3 ways to learn, you'll go beyond the fundamentals to hone your craft. Visit speculative-fictionacademy.com to learn more.
Greetings, fellow humans. I am your friendly, scruffy, tea-drinking, banana-wielding, part-time poet, part-time, I don't know, everything, indie author from Puerto Rico. I'm happy to be here and talking about poetry.
Hi, I'm Edd Stewart. I write under AF Stewart. I write fantasy and horror and all that sort of good stuff, and I mix that into my poetry. And here's some of the books I've published.
I am Edd Sowder. I used to be the second in command at Burning Willow Press, and when that shut down, I decided to start helping with editing and helping other people make their dreams come true on the backside.
My name's Ayla Ault. I write under Written by A on Twitter, Instagram. I have a website as well. I self-published my first collection of poetry called Mountains Were Calling last June as a way of kind of encapsulating my 30th birthday and 30 poems for 30 years of the journey so far. My daytime job is actually as a psychotherapist. I'm a social worker by training, so I like to mix in narrative therapy and the reflection that you get from poetry.
Hi, I'm Christina Strigas, and I've written 4 poetry books. I've self-published them. This is my latest one, Love and Metaxa, and I have also written some novels.
I think poetry is kind of the soul of life in terms of how it reflects emotion. Let's start with how poetry got in your blood first.
I haven't got a clue, frankly. I mean, I just read it, wrote it, there it was. That was just how I started.
When did you start writing it? Was it
I've been writing it since probably since I could hold a pen.
From a young age, I've just been writing poetry, and it came naturally to me. I also started to read poetry. So once I started to read it and understand it, the whole world opened up for me, and I started to just let go all the feelings and emotions that were bottled up. So for me, it's a way of explaining certain topics that are that I can't really talk about. I find it's a stream of consciousness way of explaining things that have happened in my life, personal, or in somebody else's life. And I can say it in a little poem, which is quick, and in like 5 minutes, it's done, rather than a whole novel that could take you years to write, right? So you write a poem, and you can just bring forth so much emotion in those 5 minutes or that you write that poem, and you could cover eons and decades in one poem.
I love that, Christina, because I think that's why I still write poetry. I can vividly remember being in 6th grade and a poem came to me, kind of like Willa Cather talks about, like her inspiration. She could feel it coming over the prairie. I felt like it came to me. I definitely felt like it was a poem. Like I wanted to write something that I identified with, that I wanted to read, and it just came to me. But I was always really inspired by science fiction and fantasy and imagery and Emily Dickinson, and just the way that you can feel through words that you can't always feel through just written language in general or spoken language. And that's why it keeps me here. Just like you said, it's that reflection of emotion. It's the way of processing emotion that we always get to easily.
I think there's a duality of how it began for me. First off, a coping mechanism, because when you're a broody teen, you just need to get stuff off your chest. And if you do it with metaphors and similes and stuff like that, you can veil it a bit in case someone sees your notes and you don't get into as much trouble. But it also became, from veiling it, it also helped me to decipher it, which is an interesting, juxtaposition, because for one part, you're like, I want to say it and I want to get it out of my system, but I don't want people to know. And then the other one, you're writing and you go like, oh, wow, I'm feeling this. And it was how it progressed for me. And that's one aspect. The other aspect is to try to impress the ladies. And it kind of occasionally worked.
JD kind of stepped on my toes a little bit with the impress the ladies. I joined a band when I was about 14 years old playing drums, and none of us could write lyrical sense. So I said, hell, I can do it. I read poetry. I read Shel Silverstein. I read Green Eggs and Ham, from Dr. Seuss. I can write. So I opened up the inlay cards to the cassettes that we had at the time and started reading all the lyrics from people like Ozzy Osbourne and people like Poison and Rat and, a bunch of metal bands. And I was like, well, hell, all it does is rhyme. So I started doing it that way. And I was trying to impress girls. So it worked. From the time I was about 14 to about 19, I think I wrote some 2,000 poems. And the 3 books that are out now, those are a lot of those older poems that I put together and kept a promise to a girl I tried to impress all those years ago that I would put them all out someday. Now, a lot of them are, exactly how you feel. If you wear your heart on your sleeve, you're going to have an easier time of putting it in words on paper than sometimes you can speak them. So that's where it started for me.
How much did you have to learn about poetry and its structure and everything that you feel like in order to publish? Do you feel like there was certainly a learning curve? There was something that you had to click on that you didn't have when you first just were dabbling about with poetry?
Oh, absolutely. In the beginning, I didn't know what a ballad was. I didn't know what a sonnet was. I didn't know what a simile or a metaphor was, because I didn't pay attention in school. And I took a creative writing class in my 11th grade year, and we did a couple weeks in creative writing for poetry. And so me and this girl that I was friends with in there, we got into a poetry battle, and we wanted to see who was the better poet. Well, needless to say, it turned out I was. And the teacher even rewarded us for the poems that we came up with. But I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning. Now I still say I don't know what I'm doing. I'm completely flourish at it. I throw it together, and then I go back a couple years later, look at it, revise it. This makes no sense. It doesn't work, or it's too dated, or whatever. So I go back and I revise it and try and make it a little bit better.
Well, I started out with free verse, mostly with a little haiku. And I kind of stuck with that for most of my teen years into my young adult stuff. And then when I started self-publishing, I stumbled onto a website called gather.com, which is no longer with us. But I stumbled in some poetry groups there, and another author introduced me to form poetry. And that's when I started getting serious about writing and studying the form poetry, which I do a lot now. Still do the free verse, because sometimes I don't feel like rhyming. And there's a lot of forms now I actually like to play with and dabble with, and kind of to twist them around a little bit sometimes.
Okay, I did study English literature when I was young.
Oh.
Yeah, so I studied poetry. I took poetry classes, creative writing classes when I was in university. And reading basically honed my skill a lot. Reading poetry, even up to this day, a lot of reading and writing. I started off free verse, but then I was, you'd write sonnets, we would write poetry that rhymes. In the classroom, we did so many different projects, and we did a lot of workshops. But on my own, I did mostly stream of consciousness. I preferred that and free verse. Even in my poems, that's what I tend to go with, and narrative poetry.
I've always been a bit of a rebel. I haven't wanted to learn about poetry. I've always wanted to keep it in that raw, moment by moment piece. And to my detriment to some degree. I agree with Christina. I think just reading it, writing it is the best way to learn. It's how I've learned. I definitely feel like I'm in the middle of kind of a maturity of poetry. Maybe it's because I'm finally leaving those young adult years and entering a new decade.
Yeah.
The youngest here. I do think that I've always wanted to keep it very crisp and very raw and very true and very authentic, which is very much how I want to live my life, is very authentically. It went from rhyming a lot, which you'll find on my website because it's old, to a little bit more free verse. I wanted to speak to people. I want it to resonate. And as long as it's doing that, I don't really care where it fits.
How much of your psychological background do you feel like helps your poetry? Do you think that flavors it quite a bit because you're able to tap into emotion a little bit easier?
I think that's a really interesting question because I think that I just became a therapist in the last few years.
Okay.
I was a poet first. I was a communication person first. So I was more interested in words, and I found through words you can process emotion. I also have a background in meditation, Vipassana meditation, that really kind of got me on this path and has influenced my poetry in a great way. Really, a lot of my poetry is about mindfulness and emotion and awareness and processing and enlightenment and coming to those places. So I actually think it's the other way around. I think poetry has really influenced how I am a therapist and why I got into therapy, because there's so much mental health in poetry.
To me, writing in general is always about challenging myself, and poetry in general is about how can I challenge the form and the content and different things. I don't like to flex the same muscles in each collection. The collection that I'm going to release now, everything rhymes, and I've had other collections that nothing rhymes and it's free verse, and I like the variety. And I hate when people say that they hate poetry, and I go like, which poetry do you hate? What do you think poetry is? And I always, and every book that I release, I want to challenge what people think about poetry and what poetry is, and that only a certain type of people can enjoy poetry. I also am not a fan of anything that's elitist. And I think a lot of people can get a lot more enjoyment from life if they let poetry or explore poetry in different ways. Sometimes the meter is there, sometimes the rhythm is there, sometimes the rhyme scheme is there, and I vary it. And sometimes I challenge myself to the point of breaking point. My second collection is called Dark Strands, and there's a poem there that is 72 lines, 9 stanzas, 8 stanzas, 9 lines to a stanza, and the rhyme scheme is abacadabra. And it almost drove me insane because it gets to a point like, what else rhymes with this? Because abacadabra, just in that little rhyme scheme, has A 5 times, and it's a pain in the ass. But I wanted to challenge myself in that way. In Relay of Rhymes, I have a poem that is 800 lines, 100 lines to movement, 8 movements. Each one has its own rhyme scheme. Sometimes it's free verse, sometimes it's more structured, sometimes it has a different style. And again, anything that challenges me as a writer is something that I really enjoy.
I'm wondering for you, I know that speaking multiple languages and you like to write in both Spanish and English, does it use a different part of your brain? Is it a different type of poetry that you write when you're doing 2 different languages? Or is it just a different flow? What is the subtleties about it that are different for you? My
writer voice in English and Spanish do vary. I don't say greatly, but it does have its own flavor. Also, being from Puerto Rico, that influences my inflections, my rhythm, my speed a lot. I talk a lot faster than people from other countries just because socioculturally, people from Puerto Rico speak faster. And also I have a hyperactive mind.
Era algo que yo quería probar hace mucho tiempo y nunca lo había visto en sitio y yo como que, porque vas al sitio y como que no te convence, pero cada vez que yo veo una foto yo como que estoy dañado, yo tengo que probar eso.
Pues entonces lo probó.
In terms of language, Spanish is particular because it's not as malleable as English, but it has a wider array of words. So you can do more with specific words in Spanish, but you can do more with one word in English. So it's flexing different muscles. It's exploring different things. And what I experienced from English in my brain is what I've been exposed to in movies, in music, in books, in video games. What I experienced in Spanish, it's a lot of my experiences back home and with people that I've connected, other in other places that speak Spanish. So it's 2 brains coexisting in this little noggin.
In terms of when you guys are designing collections, how you decided when you felt like a collection was ready to go. Was it you wrote a certain amount? Did you had a certain amount? I mean, Ed, you mentioned earlier that you had all these poems in your back pocket and you kind of wanted to put them out. And I'm wondering how you deciphered which way you wanted to go into what book and how you designed it.
When I designed Mirrors 1 and Mirrors 2, I was looking at what would I call this, because there's two sides to the story. There's how it feels to fall in love, and then there's how it feels when you get it ripped away. So I went through poetry that I wrote over the years and kind of read every single one of them and decided, okay, this one goes in book 1, this one goes in book 2. And then there was always something left over. So that's where Slivers and Shards came from, which is book 3. It's just what was left on the cutting room floor that I didn't think fit in both of them, or in either one quite right. So in the first one, it was like a lot of teenagers at the time, they kind of have puppy love that evolves and they break up. So, it's the distance, it's the longing, it's the heartfelt romance, it's the late phone calls, because back when I was a teenager, much like everybody else here, I would imagine, we didn't have cell phones, and we had to make, and if you had a long distance relationship because you lived on the other side in another county or whatever, there was money that had to be paid for a long distance phone call. We didn't have video chat, we didn't have internet, none of that. So you were stuck with either seeing each other on the weekends, making long distance phone calls, or writing letters. So love letters came into it. So I tried to make sure that I told the story with a lot of the poetry that I wrote back then. And then with Mirrors 2, it was the same storytelling, but it was the other side of the mirror, the darker side, the suicidal side, the crying all night, the sorrow.
My first 3 books, I actually had about, 500 to 600 page manuscript of one manuscript, let's say, but I divided into 3 because it's crazy. You can't have a book with 400 poems, right? I don't know. So what I did is I divided into 3, and then I made 3 different poetry books. I remember at one point I had all this paper, because I printed it all out on paper, all over my bedroom. I had piles. I was so confused. I was like, okay, I'm going to put this theme here. It took me forever to go through all my poems, because what I did is I had my blog. So then I redid the ones on my blog. I edited them, and then I added some new ones. So in the end, I had 3 poetry books, right? But it was hard to put them all together. And with this one, my latest one, these were all my latest poems, so that was quite easy. It was just editing it, and it took 3 years, and putting it out there took a longer time because it was accepted to 3 different publishers, and then due to COVID and due to like mental health issues of the people that were running the publishing company, that it never got published. So I had to self-publish it. So I had to, hire people to do the formatting, hire people. It was just crazy, the cover, and in the end, I did it. But it was very hectic and stressful, because when you think that a publisher is going to publish your book and you have it all ready to go, and then it just doesn't pan out and you have to do it on your own, you get really stressed and anxious, trust me.
Yeah, well, all of my collections have themes, so I just took all the poems I'd written and didn't match the theme and stuffed it in the book. And and if I needed it, I wrote new poems for like this one. This is all travel poetry, emotional places, stuff like that. That's the title, Places of Poetry. And this one's all just depressing poems. Shadows, dark tragedy, stuff like that. And of course, these are my horror poems, my horror haiku poems that I wrote on Twitter. So with a couple of extra poems and the couple extra sections in the back for other horror poems. So, that's how I make it. Just because, I've got all these poems because I do National Poetry Month every year. So I've got like 30 poems from that, and I write other poems during the year. So I've got all these poems piling up, and every once in a while I just make a theme and throw out a collection.
I've mentioned before that I normally have like a huge document where I transcribe everything. And then eventually I start sorting stuff out, like Anita said. And then when I see a theme, I see how much of that theme I have. And that's how I worked for the longest of time. And then for the last two collections, those were not in the dump file. The two new releases this year have been written in 2021. The Ballads of Hope and Joy, I actually took a lot from my Sky Thoughts and I repurposed them and I fleshed them out to do like a full poem based on the Sky Thought. How do I know when it's done and when I have that criteria has evolved with the years and with the, right now the goal is really simple, to make sure that I can have this where you can read the title of the book. If I have this, it's long enough. If I don't have this and it doesn't appear in the proof copy, I don't have enough poems and I have to keep writing.
Yeah, I like that. I think themes is the theme of the day. Sorry for being funny. But for the collection I self-published, that was kind of its own theme. I have plans for like a mythological themed collection, for a love collection, those types of themes. As I feel like they've evolved, I think of evolution. That's a word, JD, you said. And I'm like, yes, that's very much what I'm looking for. What's the evolution of the idea? Am I at a place where I want to share it based on the poems that I have? And the collection that I released, Mountains Were Calling, is very much where I came to a place of evolution that I was ready to say, okay, I'm here. I'm ready to let this idea go. And it was very much a 3-part, being kind of lost and depressed. And, next part, finding my way, finding tools, hope and discovery. And that second part of I'm here, right? I've arrived at a place where I'm in the mountains and I can see where I'm at finally. And it was very much self-serving. I think I mentioned that already. And I'm okay with that because that's how we share with others. I had moved from the Midwest to Denver area, and had been something I'd been wanting to do since I was, 16 years old, and finally made it happen in my life after a lot of life changes and stress and divorces and things like that. So for me, it was very much, what have I learned in the last 30 years that I am proud of, that I want to share, that is something that I think could help other people. And so it's very much like, okay, what do I have? What's new and old that fits in these 3D ideas of what the journey is? And printed it out and went through what works, what doesn't work, what's a good poem and what is just really not. And kind of put it together. And it, again, just as a poem kind of has like a rise and a fall and a feeling, and when it's complete, I think a book and a collection needs to have that feeling as well. And so it's very much a tossing and turning and shuffling until it feels like there's a rising, a falling, and a settling. And then I knew, okay, it was time to press publish. This is complete.
It's been mentioned a couple of times, there's people who say, I won't absolutely read poetry. There's people who love poetry. And I'm curious, because of that idea, knowing that it's a niche market, knowing that this is, you're bearing your soul essentially in a lot of this, how much do the rules influence you? How much do you feel like, is there a rule that you follow? Is there something that you really gravitate towards in terms of what rules are of poetry, structure is of poetry? Is there something that you really resonates with you that you keep a hold of so that you are kind of appeasing a crowd that maybe would be interested in reading what you're doing?
You can break the rules, but if you want to write a sonnet, you cannot break the rules. And you have to write a sonnet that's really the best that you can write. So if ever I say, okay, I'm going to put a sonnet, which I did put in one of my books, I really worked hard at it. You know what I mean? But the rest of the poems, I find like I kind of just automatically use devices in my poems without thinking about it. It's just a natural way of writing, imagery and similes for me. And I can just write it. I don't really overthink it unless, I really want to portray something, an image or nature in a certain way. It depends on the theme.
I mean, I grew up in Detroit when the beginning of the rap era started. So everybody was walking around to Run DMC and all that. So everything that rappers did rhymed. And it was not so much haiku or anything like that. I mean, I listen to a lot of heavy metal, and I don't see where anything that I listen to doesn't rhyme. Country music rhymes, 90% of it anyway. I mean, rock music rhymes, rap rhymes. You can't really write lyrics and not have it rhyme unless you're like school or something. But I mean, for me,
About Dylan.
I'm writing it, it has to rhyme. So, but I do appreciate people who can, find that meter in the middle and make the middle of the sentence do all the rhythm for them. I have a harder time doing that.
I write form poetry, but even within the form, I like to shift it a little bit because, I mean, a lot of my subject matter is not, I mean, I wrote 2 books on horror haiku. I mean, haiku is not usually horror. So, yeah, so I changed the subject up a lot with the poetry. I do a lot of space stuff, horror stuff, fantasy stuff, and forms, free verse, and just mix it up. And even, sometimes I'll mix the forms up if I don't like it. Or if it's hard, I'll just, okay, it's too hard, I'm going to do what I want. It's going to be close. I did write a couple of serial killer poems, but a lot of my stuff isn't horror or death. I mean, I actually wrote a love poem in one of my books. I think it was Colors of Poetry. There's a love poem in there. So,
do you like? Is that why you like poetry? It kind of flexes a different muscle for you too. It kind of gives you a different.
Yeah, because I mean, I can use poetry to express whatever emotion I want, and because when I'm writing my books, I want to kill people. I don't know why, it just comes out anyway. But when I'm writing poetry, I can write about anything, and even when I'm writing the stuff, the fantasy, the monsters, I twist it so the monsters aren't always monsters sometimes. So yeah, it's poetry's more flexible for me.
I am such a rule follower that if I really kept to rules, I wouldn't write. I would be just too anxious in a little ball, being like, I'm not doing it right. So I try to only have the rule that, do I connect with it? Does it feel like a poem to me? Is it something that feels like a piece of humanity that we all kind of experience in one way, shape, or form? And then I'll maybe share it with the world. But I think with the rules, I feel like poetry shouldn't have rules because it's the one place that we can truly express ourselves. Now, I'd love to try different styles and voices on. Does that mean that I can do experimental poetry? I don't understand the rules of that. Like, how do you do that? What are the rules there?
And that rhymes.
Ayla's a rebel.
You'd never correct.
Me, I am ridiculously self-serving with everything that I publish, and poetry is no exception. The rules that I follow, the Estrada rules, are, to Christina's point, I can't bear writing anything that's boring or something that someone else could write. To me, it's very important that someone reads something and at the very least they go like, JD, write that? That sounds kind of like JD. That's like his quirky thought pattern in that expression. Second off, surprising people, either with form or content or how the poem resolves itself. Quite often for me, I think that a poem is kind of like a stand-up joke. You have like the setup, you have the, it develops, and then you have the punchline. And, what tone do I want for the punchline? Do I want to make you sad? Do I want to make you happy? Do I want to make you hopeful? Do I want to make you laugh? And, it's always, to me, the end game is often those last two lines. Not always. It's not a rule. But it does happen often because I like that setup, and I like people to read that last line and go like, ah, and that can vary depending on my intention.
Me too. I like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like that.
I think with all poets, we have unique minds. We kind of see the emotional rawness that we live in our lives, and we have the ability to put it down on paper and tell a story through it, or make a connection to somebody else's heart and mind and even their soul with our words. So if we can put it down on paper and somebody else reads it and they relate to it on some basic level, we've done our job as a poet.
I took a small detour into songwriting, which didn't turn out well, but we won't talk about that.
I'll cut that part out.
No, you can post it, just we won't talk about it.
I was gonna say you could have 400 poems in a book, but that gives me the right to call you the J.R.R. Tolkien of poetry.